Chris Nanos, the sheriff whose department is leading this investigation, he is losing trust with the community and his colleagues. A union representing hundreds of Pima County Sheriff's deputies is calling on him to resign after a majority of them supported a no confidence vote this week. You don't hear about this kind of thing happening very often. Let's go right now to News Nation's Brian Anton, who's been following this case from day one. Brian, some Pima County supervisors have serious concerns about Sheriff Nanos' work history.
55 days, and still no trace of Nancy Guthrie, an 84-year-old woman gone. Not from a remote hiking trail, not from a crowded public place, but from the one location that's supposed to be the safest, her own bedroom. And that's where the story begins to feel deeply unsettling. In the early morning hours of February 1st, 2026, inside a quiet home in the Catalina foothills near Tucson, something happened. Something violent enough to leave behind just a few chilling clues, but not enough to tell a complete story. Nancy Guthrie, mother of Savannah Guthrie, had been in bed. There were no immediate signs of forced entry publicly confirmed, no smashed windows, no obvious break-in, just silence, followed by confusion, followed by fear. And then, drops of blood. Not inside the bedroom, where you might expect a struggle, but outside, on the front porch. That detail alone raises a disturbing possibility. Did whatever happened begin inside and end outside? Or was Nancy somehow moved? But here's where things take a darker turn. Nancy wasn't just any missing person. She was 84 years old. She had a pacemaker. She required daily heart medication, medication she didn't have with her, which means from the very first hours, this wasn't just a disappearance. It was a race against time. And that urgency triggered something massive. Within hours, local authorities mobilized. Within days, the FBI stepped in. Search teams, helicopters, ground units, combing through terrain, knocking on doors, retracing every possible step. Authorities confirm signs of a struggle and are actively searching for leads. But even as the search expanded, a detail emerged that shifted the tone of the investigation. Doorbell camera footage captured sometime during the night a figure, masked, moving through the area carrying what appeared to be a distinctive backpack. Not running, not panicking, just moving. And this is the part no one can fully explain. Was this the person responsible, or just someone in the wrong place at the worst possible time? Because investigators haven't publicly confirmed that connection, but the image alone was enough to ignite concern and speculation and questions. What was inside that backpack? Why that house? Why that night? And perhaps, most importantly, how did someone get close enough to take an elderly woman from her own home without immediately triggering a larger alarm?
That crime scene that might tell a different story to what the public knows.
You know, for me, I would have to say there's two things. One, from the video, the way he manipulates those flowers is so strange to me. I can't stop thinking about it. And then the other is obviously right there, the blood spatter. There are 4 separate, to me, patterns there. So there's the drops, the 90-degree angle drops that you see that look like it might be from a nosebleed. Then there's the medium to high velocity spatter that some people have said they think that it's drops within a drop, but I don't. I think it's where she coughed.
But as the search intensified, attention quietly started shifting somewhere else, away from the masked figure, away from the unknown suspect, and towards something far more uncomfortable, the investigation itself. At the center of it all was Sheriff Chris Nanos, the public face of the case, the one giving updates, the one assuring the community that progress was being made, the one standing in front of cameras, trying to balance urgency with control. But then questions began to surface, and they didn't come from nowhere. Some observers pointed out that the crime scene, Nancy's home, may have been released earlier than expected, not officially confirmed as a mistake, but enough to raise eyebrows. Because in cases like this, the first hours matter. Every footprint, every fiber, every unnoticed detail, gone forever if not preserved correctly. And that's when some observers began asking, was something mishandled from the beginning? It's a question that hasn't gone away. Online discussions started gaining traction, threads, videos, comments dissecting every decision, every timeline, every public statement. Did investigators lose critical time? Was the scene compromised before all evidence was collected? Could that have changed the direction of the case entirely? Now, to be clear, there's no official confirmation that any critical mistake was made, but the perception alone, that's powerful. Because once doubt enters a case like this, it spreads and it sticks. At the same time, the emotional weight continued to build. Nancy's family, especially Savannah Guthrie, appeared publicly, holding back tears, describing the pain as unbearable, pleading for answers, pleading for help, hoping that someone somewhere saw something that could bring Nancy home. But even in those moments of heartbreak, the questions didn't stop. They multiplied. Because now this wasn't just about a missing woman. It was about whether the system designed to find her was already under pressure, or worse, already falling behind. An 84-year-old woman vanishes without a trace, and within days, questions aren't just about who took her, but whether the investigation itself was already falling apart. To understand what may have happened to Nancy Guthrie, investigators didn't just look at the night she vanished. They went backwards, days, then weeks, and that's where things begin to feel even more calculated. Because at some point during the investigation, authorities made a very specific request, surveillance footage not just from February 1, but from January 11, nearly 3 weeks earlier. Now, think about that for a second. This wasn't random. This wasn't routine. This was targeted, which leads to an uncomfortable question. But why would investigators suddenly look weeks before the abduction? That decision alone suggests something critical, the possibility that whoever took Nancy didn't just act on impulse. They may have been watching, planning, studying the environment. And if that's true, then this wasn't just a crime of opportunity, it was something far more deliberate. And that's where another detail starts to stand out. Reports began circling about a masked individual seen in the area, not just on the night of the disappearance, but possibly earlier. Unconfirmed, not officially tied, but enough to raise concern, because if someone was moving through that neighborhood weeks before the abduction, then the timeline doesn't start on February 1, it starts long before anyone realized something was wrong. January 11, unusual activity. February 1, Nancy disappears. And somewhere in between, a window of time that no one can fully account for. But here's where things get even more unsettling. Investigators also began looking at a nearby vacant home. Not occupied, not active, just there, sitting quietly in the same area where Nancy was taken. And according to emerging discussions, it may have been considered as a possible staging point. Now, again, nothing confirmed, but the idea itself that someone could have used an empty property to observe, prepare, or even wait adds a new layer to this case, because it suggests proximity, familiarity, and patience. But as these details started surfacing, attention began shifting again, not toward the suspect, but how all of this was being handled. At the center of that scrutiny remained Sheriff Chris Nanos, and this time the questions were louder. Some critics began pointing to potential delays in securing full neighborhood surveillance, not just one home, but multiple angles, multiple properties, because in cases like this, timing is everything. Footage gets overwritten, deleted, lost, and if it's not collected quickly, it's gone. Some critics believe those early hours may have been crucial, and that any delay, no matter how small, could have cost investigators valuable insight into what really happened that night. And then there's the issue of the perimeter. How quickly was the area fully locked down? Who had access? What movements went untracked? These aren't accusations, but they are questions, and in a case with so few answers, questions carry weight. And then a political storm began forming around the very man leading the investigation. Around March 12th, a formal recall petition was filed against Sheriff Chris Nanos. And while recall efforts can happen for many reasons, this case became a central talking point. Critics didn't hold back. They pointed directly at the handling of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, suggesting missteps, delays, decisions that may have shaped the entire trajectory of the investigation. And that's when the narrative began to escalate. Online discussions intensified, videos, threads, analysis breaking down every public statement, every timeline update, every shift in tone. He lost the case early. Critical mistakes can't be undone. Strong claims, emotionally charged, and impossible to ignore.
It looks to me, Jackson, like there was blood on somebody's hand right here and maybe on their palm where they just touched down. It almost looks like a Rorschach test, where it looks like a butterfly or different animals to somebody.
But are you also intimating that you think one person was involved instead of two?
Again, I'm going to go off the evidence. We have somebody at the front door. We have one person. We have somebody that surveyed and was stalking the house before, whether it's, the January 11th date or the 24th date. It's one person. We don't have drag marks. We don't have scuff marks. We don't have footprints. I don't have anything right now
But here's where the tension deepens, because not everyone agrees. Supporters of Sheriff Chris Nanos argue that this is exactly what complex investigations look like. Multiple agencies, thousands of leads, coordination that takes time. They point out that the FBI is involved, that forensic work is ongoing, that progress doesn't always happen in public view, and that rushing conclusions can be just as dangerous as missing evidence. So which is it? Is this simply public frustration driven by fear and uncertainty? Or are these concerns pointing to something deeper? Because when you step back and look at the full timeline, it doesn't just show what happened before Nancy disappeared. It reveals gaps, moments that feel incomplete, decisions that are being questioned, and a growing divide between those who trust the process and those who believe something may have gone wrong. The timeline doesn't just reveal what happened before Nancy disappeared. It raises a more uncomfortable question. Were the first critical hours already slipping out of control?
As the days turned into weeks, the search for Nancy Guthrie began to change. The helicopters faded, the large ground sweeps slowed, and in their place came something quieter, more precise, more technical. The investigation had officially entered its forensic phase. Behind the scenes, analysts were now focused on what couldn't be seen with the naked eye: DNA traces, microscopic fibers, digital footprints, the kind of evidence that doesn't shout, but whispers. And sometimes those whispers are enough to solve everything. Investigators confirmed they were working with DNA evidence, not clean, definitive samples, but mixed DNA, the kind that complicates things, the kind that requires time and careful interpretation. There were also discussions about possible glove DNA, which raises an immediate question. If gloves were used, was the suspect trying to avoid leaving a trace, or did they still leave something behind without realizing it? Because even the smallest fragment, skin cells, sweat, transfer DNA, can become the thread that unravels an entire case. And that's where genetic genealogy enters the picture. A powerful tool, one that has solved cases decades old. By comparing unknown DNA to public databases, investigators can sometimes trace a suspect through distant relatives, meaning even if the person has never been in the system, their family might be. But just as the science began catching up, something didn't quite add up, because alongside the forensic developments, another piece of this case continued to raise eyebrows: the ransom notes. Multiple communications reportedly sent not just to the family, but to media outlets, demanding millions, not in cash, but in cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, digital, harder to trace, at least on the surface. And this is where the situation becomes complicated. Because these messages weren't random, they included certain details that were not publicly known at the time, details that suggested whoever sent them had some level of inside awareness. Now that could mean one of two things. Either the person responsible was directly involved, or someone was attempting to insert themselves into the case. And that leads to a difficult question. Was this a real kidnapping, or something staged to look like one? Because historically, ransom demands are meant to establish contact, to negotiate, to create a line between the suspect and the victim's family. But in this case, there was no confirmed payment, no proof of life, no clear continuation of communication, just messages and then silence. And that silence has become one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire investigation. But as analysts continued examining the evidence, critics began circling back to something that had already sparked concern: the early handling of the scene. Because in forensic investigations, timing is everything. Evidence is fragile. It degrades, it transfers, it disappears. And if a scene isn't secured properly from the beginning, the consequences can be permanent. Some critics suggest that if the crime scene was released too early or not fully processed before access was reopened, it could have affected the integrity of the evidence collected later. Now, again, this remains a point of debate, not confirmed fact, but the concern itself carries weight. Because if that evidence was compromised, what does that mean for everything that came after? Every test, every result, every conclusion drawn from those samples. Could they still be trusted, or would they always carry a shadow of doubt? And this is where the case begins to split into two competing narratives. On one side, there are those who believe the early stages may have introduced problems that can't be undone. They point to the reported early release of the home, alleged delays in gathering full evidence, and public inconsistencies that have fueled uncertainty.
But on the other side, there's a very different perspective, one grounded in the reality of modern investigations. Because the FBI is involved, advanced forensic labs are working the evidence. Genetic genealogy isn't deployed lightly. It's used when there's real potential for a breakthrough. And officials, including Sheriff Chris Nanos, continue to maintain that progress is being made, even if it's not visible to the public. So which version is closer to the truth? Is this a case slowly being solved behind the scenes, or one that may have been quietly complicated from the very start? As that question lingers, the emotional pressure continues to build. Nancy's family hasn't stepped back. They've leaned in. Public appeals, emotional interviews, visible exhaustion, and a reward that has now climbed to staggering levels, combining family contributions and federal support, a clear signal of desperation and urgency. At the same time, online discussions haven't slowed down. If anything, they've intensified. People analyzing every detail, every report, every theory. Some are beginning to wonder if the investigation was ever on the right track to begin with. And that thought, once it takes hold, is hard to shake. Because now every piece of evidence is viewed through two lenses, what it shows and what it might be hiding. The evidence is there, but whether it's pointing towards the truth or buried under early mistakes is something no one can fully agree on.
55 days later, and the case feels more complicated than ever. What began as a desperate search for an elderly woman has slowly transformed into something else entirely, something heavier, something harder to define. Because despite all the resources, all the attention, all the urgency, there is still no suspect, no arrest, no confirmed proof of life. And that silence is where the most unsettling questions begin to grow. Every piece of this case, every detail, every decision has now been pulled apart, analyzed, debated, not just by investigators, but by the public. And when you step back and look at the full picture, a pattern begins to emerge. Not a clear answer, but a theory. One that's gaining attention, even if it remains impossible to prove. A growing theory suggests the biggest setback in this case may not have been the suspect, but the investigation itself. Now, to be clear, this is not a confirmed conclusion, but it's a suspicion that continues to surface. Because in cases like this, the first hours are everything. The first response, the first decisions, the first pieces of evidence collected or missed. Those moments don't just matter, they define everything that comes after. And once they're gone, they can't be recreated.
Yeah, this is really getting serious. Elizabeth, you mentioned the no confidence vote. All 306 deputies in the union, I am told, voted that they do not have confidence in the sheriff. Every single one, 306 in the union out of 400 deputies in total. There's about 100 who are not in the union. Meanwhile, the sheriff has come under fire not only by some for his handling of the Nancy Guthrie investigation. Remember, this is now day 53 since Nancy just vanished, and there are still no suspects. There's been no...
And this is where the story takes an uncomfortable turn, because if that theory holds any weight, then the question isn't just who did this, it's whether the opportunity to find out was already slipping away from the very beginning. But before jumping to conclusions, there's another possibility that can't be ignored, one that paints a very different picture. What if the person responsible was simply that good? Highly organized, careful, patient, someone who studied the environment, possibly weeks in advance, someone who knew when to move and how to avoid detection, the masked figure, the timing, the lack of clear entry, the controlled nature of the scene, all of it could point toward a calculated operation, a plan executed with precision. And if that's the case, then even a flawless investigation might have struggled to keep up. But then again, there's the other side, the one that continues to raise questions. Early concerns about how the scene was handled, discussions about whether critical footage was secured quickly enough, moments in the timeline that feel incomplete. And at the center of that conversation remains Sheriff Chris Nanos, a figure now caught between two narratives, one that sees him as leading a complex, high-pressure investigation in real time, and another that questions whether early decisions may have shaped the outcome in ways that can't be undone. And this is where things become difficult, because both can exist at the same time. An investigation can be active and still face criticism. Progress can be happening while doubt continues to grow. And in a case with no clear resolution, that tension doesn't go away, it deepens. Meanwhile, the emotional reality hasn't changed. Nancy Guthrie is still missing, her family is still waiting, and the weight of that uncertainty continues to show. Savannah Guthrie, after weeks of stepping away, is now preparing to return to television, to step back into the public eye while carrying something no one watching can fully understand. The hope, the fear, the unanswered questions. And even now, the pleas continue, for tips, for information, for anything that might move this case forward. But outside of that, something else continues to grow. Division, because the public is no longer just asking what happened, they're choosing sides. Some believe this was a sophisticated crime carried out by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Others believe the truth may have been within reach, but slipped away in those early, critical hours. And that divide is what keeps this case alive in conversation. So where does that leave us? Is Sheriff Chris Nanos being unfairly blamed for a case that was always going to be difficult? Or are these concerns impossible to ignore because they point to something deeper, something uncomfortable, something unresolved? Because after 55 days, we're left with more than just a missing person case. We're left with a story that refuses to settle, a timeline that raises as many questions as it answers, and a theory that no one can fully prove. An 84-year-old woman disappears into the night. No answers, no resolution. But as the search continues, one question refuses to go away. Was this case doomed from the start? Or is the truth still being hidden somewhere, waiting to be uncovered?